The lake stretched wide beneath a sky brushed with streaks of late summer clouds. Sunlight shimmered against the surface, making the ripples look like scattered coins tossed by invisible hands. Sarah Mitchell dipped her paddle into the cool water, her kayak gliding steadily as she tried to absorb every detail of the Minnesota wilderness around her. She had come here for silence, for the kind of peace that only comes when the world seems untouched by time. Vacations were rare for her. As a history teacher from Ohio, she spent most of her days surrounded by textbooks and timelines, trying to spark curiosity in restless teenagers. Now away from the hum of school bells and crowded hallways, she felt light, unburdened. The gentle rhythm of the paddle, the breeze carrying the scent of pine, and the calls of distant loons were enough to remind her why she had chosen this trip. But peace rarely lasts when history has been waiting to resurface. Her eyes narrowed when she noticed a faint, irregular shape beneath the water, just a few yards from the tour group's route. At first she thought it was a fallen tree, but something about the outline struck her as unnatural. Flat lines, hard edges, not the curves of nature. The sun shifted, and the water gave away a glint of metal. A chill crawled down her spine. She leaned closer, heart knocking hard against her ribs as the outline of a roof became undeniable. A vehicle, submerged, forgotten, and hidden for decades. Before we go further, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories like this one, because sometimes the past returns in ways no one expects. Sarah's hand trembled as she lifted her paddle, signaling the guide. Her voice cracked with urgency. "There's something under the water." "Right there, look." The tour guide, a broad-shouldered man with weathered skin from years on the lake, squinted at the spot she indicated. Other kayakers slowed, curious murmurs passing from one boat to the next. Soon the air was filled with the tension of discovery, a mix of excitement and unease. "What do you see?" the guide asked, steering closer. "It looks like a car," Sarah replied, her throat tightening. "I'm sure of it." The guide frowned, pushing his sunglasses higher on his nose. After a pause, he muttered, "I'll call it in. Stay where you are, folks." The group fell silent. Only the steady lap of water against plastic hulls broke the stillness. Sarah's pulse raced as she stared at the shadow beneath her kayak. Questions crowded her mind. How long had it been there? Who had driven it? And why had no one found it until now? Her fellow tourists whispered theories. Maybe it was stolen, maybe it was an accident. But Sarah's thoughts drifted elsewhere. She had always believed that objects left behind told stories. That belief had guided her through archives, museums, and classrooms. And now, in the middle of a serene Minnesota lake, she felt history tugging at her again. One of the kayakers, an older woman with silver hair tied back beneath her hat, leaned over. "You don't just find cars at the bottom of a lake. There's a story here, you mark my words." Sarah nodded, her throat dry. And I want to know what it is." She didn't realize then that her curiosity would do more than satisfy an academic itch. It would draw her into a community still haunted by unanswered questions, into a puzzle woven through decades of silence, guilt, and loss. The ripples on that lake were just the beginning. For now, all Sarah could do was stare at the shadowy car beneath the water, her heart already whispering that the story waiting there would change her life forever. The hum of conversation rippled through the group as the kayakers gathered closer, their boats bobbing gently in the water. The tour guide's voice cut through the tension, steady but firm. "Everyone stay calm. Let's give some space. I'll notify the sheriff's office. This isn't something we can handle ourselves." Sarah's chest tightened as she drifted back a few feet, though her eyes never left the faint metallic glint beneath the lake. The knowledge that something hidden for decades lay beneath her kayak pressed on her like a weight. Her vacation had been meant for relaxation, but she could already sense she was being pulled into something much larger. The guide pulled out a waterproof radio, his voice low as he relayed what had been found. The other tourists exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered with a tone of awe, others with unease. A man behind Sarah muttered, "Lord, what if there's a body in there?" The words sent a ripple of discomfort through the group. By the time the sheriff's office arrived with a boat, the afternoon sun was dipping lower, casting long golden streaks across the water. Sarah remained silent, observing the deputies as they anchored near the site. She could see the seriousness etched on their faces, a shift from curiosity to grim duty. One deputy, tall with greying hair at his temples, stood out to her. His voice carried authority, yet his eyes scanned the tourists with caution. "I'm Deputy Mark Stevens. I'll need statements from each of you, starting with whoever spotted this." Sarah raised her hand before anyone else could speak. "It was me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Stevens nodded, gesturing for her to paddle closer to the patrol boat. "Tell me exactly what you saw." She swallowed hard, glancing once more at the water before answering. "I thought it was a tree trunk at first, but when the sun hit it I saw the roofline, straight edges. It's a car." "I'm sure of it." Stevens studied her face for a moment, as though weighing her sincerity. Then he scribbled into a small notepad. "You have a good eye. Not everyone notices details like that." Her cheeks warmed, though not from pride. "I'm a history teacher," she replied softly. "I spend a lot of time looking at things other people overlook." That answer seemed to soften his expression. Still, his tone carried caution. "I'll tell you this much. Once something like this surfaces, it can stir up memories people thought were long buried. Folks around here, they don't always take kindly to outsiders digging into the past." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "Do you think someone will be upset that I found it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the lake where the water had already begun swallowing the outline of the car again. Finally, he said, "Let's just say this county has its share of unsolved stories. Some people would rather leave them that way." The words stuck with her, heavier than she expected. The other kayakers were being directed back to shore, their laughter subdued, their voices hushed. What had started as a scenic tour had shifted into something that felt like the first step of a long road. On shore, Stevens approached her again, while the others filed into vans to return to town. His boots crunched against gravel as he stopped in front of her. "I'll need your contact information," he said, pen ready. "If this turns into more than just a sunken car, you'll probably be hearing from us." She hesitated, then gave him her details. "Do you think it's connected to someone missing?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Maybe. But don't go borrowing trouble yet. Let us do our job." Sarah nodded, though unease lingered. She had no intention of overstepping, but deep down she knew herself well enough to recognize the pull. History whispered through that lake, and she wasn't the type to ignore whispers. As she watched the sheriff's boat idle near the site, she couldn't help but wonder, whose story had been lying beneath the water all these years, waiting to be uncovered? The thought gnawed at her as the sun slid lower, casting the lake into shadows, hinting that the discovery was only the beginning. The next morning, Sarah lingered in the small-town diner near her motel, sipping coffee that tasted faintly of burnt beans. The place had an air of familiarity, the kind of spot where regulars knew each other by name and newcomers drew curious glances. Old photographs lined the walls, fishing contests, county fairs, high school football teams. It felt as if time had slowed decades ago and never caught up. Her mind replayed the image of the submerged car. She had barely slept, her thoughts circling the possibilities. When the sheriff's office confirmed later that morning that the vehicle had been registered to a man named Robert Hayes, known to most as Bobby, an unease spread through town like smoke. People lowered their voices when the name surfaced, as though speaking it too loudly might stir something they preferred left alone. "Bobby Hayes disappeared in '85, the waitress said, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of Sarah. Her tone carried the weight of gossip sharpened by years of silence. "Drove out of town one night and never came back. Some said he ran off, others said worse." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you think happened?" The woman's eyes flicked toward a table of older men in baseball caps before she replied. "I think people know more than they say. But in a town like this, silence keeps the peace." The words lodged in Sarah's chest. Silence keeps the peace. She wrote the phrase in her notebook, underlining it twice. Later she found herself standing on the courthouse steps, where a group of locals had gathered, speaking in low tones about the discovery. She caught fragments, mentions of high school days, of how Bobby was popular but reckless, of how his family had suffered. Each word deepened the mystery. One man, tall and thin with a face lined from years outdoors, looked at her with suspicion. "You're the tourist who found the car, aren't you?" "Yes," she admitted. "I didn't mean to intrude, I just happened to see it." He grunted. "Well, it stirred things up. Some of us worked real hard to move on." Before she could reply, a softer voice joined the conversation. An older woman clutching a grocery bag shook her head. "Don't talk to her like that, Pete. Maybe now the Hayes family will finally get some answers. Lord knows Linda never stopped praying for this day." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Linda, a sister. There was family still here, living with questions unanswered for more than 3 decades. As the day stretched on, the name Bobby Hayes wove itself through every corner of town. People recalled how he worked at the local hardware store, how he loved to drive his Chevy fast down country roads, how he had big dreams of leaving the small town for something larger. Yet under those stories lingered tension, a sense that his memory carried something unresolved. That evening, when Sarah walked along the quiet main street, she noticed faded posters still hanging inside a glass case near City Hall. "Missing, Robert Hayes, last seen July 1985. The photograph showed a young man with a confident smile, his arm slung casually around a friend's shoulder. Seeing his face made everything real in a way the submerged car had not. Her chest tightened with empathy. She imagined his family, waiting year after year for answers that never came. What kind of grief lived in such waiting? What kind of silence surrounded it? Deputy Stevens found her there, hands in his pockets, his voice low. "You're not the only one asking questions. Folks are digging through old memories now. Some are helpful. Some are angry." Sarah looked at him, determination flickering in her eyes. "I just want to understand who he was. What really happened." Stevens studied her for a long moment before replying, "Then you'd better be ready. Around here, memories aren't just stories. They're loyalties, grudges, and scars. And once you start pulling at threads, you never know what might unravel." His warning echoed in her mind as the streetlights hummed to life, painting the small town in dim yellow glow. The past was no longer buried. It was awake, and it was pulling her deeper. The motel room felt too small for Sarah's restless energy. She paced by the window, notebook open on the desk, its pages already filled with hurried scribbles about Bobby Hayes. Each note seemed to spark another question, and each question pulled her deeper. She told herself she was only curious, just documenting what she'd stumbled upon, but she knew it was more than that. The story had taken hold of her. By mid-morning, she decided to walk back into town. The streets were quiet, shaded by maple trees just beginning to turn with hints of autumn. Every corner held a reminder of the past: brick storefronts with peeling paint, faded signs from businesses long closed. She imagined Bobby walking these same sidewalks decades ago, young and full of plans, unaware of how his life would end. At the small grocery store, she asked the clerk casually if he knew where Bobby's family lived. The man's eyes narrowed slightly before he answered. "His sister still stays out by the old Miller farm, Linda Hayes, but you might think twice before showing up there uninvited." Sarah thanked him and left, her determination outweighing the warning. She followed the directions, eventually finding herself on a gravel road lined with tall grasses and weathered barns. A white farmhouse came into view, its paint chipped, its porch sagging, but it carried the kind of resilience that spoke of decades of endurance. She hesitated at the gate, but before she could knock, the door opened. A woman in her 50s stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her hair was streaked with grey, her eyes sharp yet weary. "You're the one who found the car," Linda said, not as a question but as a statement. Sarah nodded. "Yes. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I thought you might want to know I'm trying to learn more about him." For a moment silence stretched between them, then Linda sighed and motioned toward the porch. "Come on up. No use standing out there." Sarah climbed the steps, her pulse quickening. She sat in a rocking chair as Linda settled opposite her. "People in this town stopped talking about Bobby a long time ago. Linda began, her voice steady but tinged with hurt. They acted like he never existed, but I never forgot. Not a day goes by I don't wonder what really happened. Sarah leaned forward. What do you remember about that night? Linda's gaze drifted to the horizon. He left after dinner, said he needed to clear his head. He'd been restless, talking about getting out of this place, about starting fresh somewhere else. I thought he was serious, but then he just vanished. No note, no goodbye, nothing. Everyone said he must have run away, but I knew better. Bobby wouldn't have left me like that. Emotion tightened her throat, and Sarah felt it herself, a pang of empathy, sharp and raw. I believe you, Sarah said softly. Linda's eyes flicked back to her. Why does this matter to you, Miss Mitchell? You could go home and forget all of this. Why carry it? Sarah searched for the right words. Because stories like Bobby's deserve to be told. Because silence isn't justice. And because maybe if the truth comes out, it can bring you some peace. Linda studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. If you're serious, then you'll need to be ready for resistance. People around here protect their own. They don't like outsiders asking questions. I understand, Sarah replied, though her heart raced. Linda's voice lowered. Then I'll help you. Whatever I can remember, whatever scraps I've kept, I'll share them, but you'll have to dig for the rest. And you might not like what you find. The weight of her words settled heavy in the air. Sarah knew she had crossed a line, stepped from curiosity into commitment, and once committed, there was no turning back. Sarah's next stop was the county archives, a red brick building that smelled faintly of dust and varnish. Inside, rows of metal filing cabinets and shelves stacked with newspapers created a quiet maze. A clerk, grey-haired and polite but distracted, waved her toward the microfilm machines when she asked about 1985 records. Hours passed as she cranked through reels, the soft whir of the machine echoing in the stillness. Headlines from that summer flickered before her eyes, parades, farm reports, local elections, until finally a bold line leapt out. Young man missing. Robert Hayes, last seen leaving local diner. Her pulse quickened as she leaned closer. The article described how Bobby had been spotted at Murphy's diner one July night, arguing with a friend before storming out. Witnesses recalled him heading toward his car. The piece mentioned he never returned home, leaving behind confusion and speculation. Sarah scribbled notes furiously. This was more than rumor. It was the last trace of him alive. She read and reread the name of the friend, Tom Miller. She felt a stir of recognition. Linda had mentioned the Miller farm. The pieces were starting to link, forming the edges of a picture not yet clear. When Sarah left the archives, the sky was low with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. If Tom Miller had been the last to see Bobby, then he carried a piece of the truth. Whether he had spoken it back then or not was another matter. Back at the diner, Sarah asked the waitress if Tom still lived in town. The woman hesitated, then nodded toward the outskirts. Runs a repair shop these days, keeps to himself mostly. Folks respect him, but he's not one for talking about the past. Sarah's coffee sat untouched as she weighed her next step. The town's reluctance to revisit old wounds was becoming clearer, and yet she felt an unshakable pull to press forward. Every answer led to more questions, and each question tightened her connection to Bobby's story. As she prepared to leave, an elderly man at the counter leaned closer. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. Be careful asking about Bobby Hayes. People have long memories here, and some memories are better left alone. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Better for whom? He didn't answer, only returned to stirring his coffee with a trembling hand. That evening, Sarah walked past the courthouse square, where rain had begun to fall in a soft drizzle, darkening the pavement and soaking the faded posters in the case. She thought about Linda, holding on to scraps of hope for 34 years. She thought about Tom Miller carrying the burden of being the last one to see Bobby, and she thought about Bobby himself, his story frozen in time, waiting for someone to pull it forward. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead, but she hardly noticed. She felt as though she were standing on the threshold of something heavy and unavoidable. She wasn't chasing idle curiosity anymore. She was pursuing justice for a voice silenced decades ago. In her notebook she wrote, "Next step, Tom Miller." The name looked stark against the page, heavy with implications. Closing the notebook, she whispered to herself, "If he knows the truth, I'll find it." Her words felt like a vow, swallowed by the rain but alive inside her chest. She was no longer just a tourist passing through. She was part of a story that demanded to be finished, whether the town wanted it told or not. By the time divers returned to the lake, the news had spread through town like wildfire. People gathered along the shore, umbrellas sprouting under the grey sky as if drawn by an invisible magnet. Sarah stood among them, rain seeping into her jacket, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. She felt the collective breath of the crowd hold still as the divers prepared their equipment. Deputy Stevens moved through the gathering with a calm authority, though his jaw was tight. He stopped beside Sarah, his voice low so only she could hear. "You sure you want to be here? This isn't going to be easy to watch." "I need to see it," she said without hesitation. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, then he gave a curt nod before turning back toward the lake. The water broke as divers resurfaced, signaling for the crane to begin. Metal groaned as chains tightened, and the lake, reluctant to give up its secret, released the car inch by inch. Mud and weeds clung to its surface, years of silence clinging like a shroud. The shape slowly revealed itself, the rusted body of a Chevy, its windows clouded, its paint long surrendered to the water. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Sarah's breath caught as the car settled onto the shore. What had once been an ordinary vehicle was now a relic of mystery, each dent and crack whispering of the night it vanished. Stevens moved closer, instructing onlookers to stay back as deputies approached the vehicle. Cameras flashed, evidence bags appeared, and every step was measured with solemn care. Sarah's heart pounded as she craned her neck to see. From inside, divers pulled out a deteriorated wallet, its leather fragile, its contents half-faded. They laid it carefully into a bag, the name on an old driver's license barely legible but unmistakable, Robert Hayes. The murmurs of the crowd rose into a swell of voices, some breaking with emotion, others sharp with speculation. Then came something smaller, more personal. A tarnished ring, its design simple but intimate, as though it had once meant something more than adornment. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she thought of Linda, waiting all these years for something tangible, something that proved her brother had not simply walked away. Finally, a deputy lifted a fragment of paper from the car's interior. It was fragile, eaten away by time and water, but there were words still visible, faint lines of handwriting. Stevens took it carefully, his expression unreadable as he sealed it in plastic. The official word from the sheriff's office was cautious. "We cannot yet determine the circumstances surrounding Robert Hayes's disappearance. At this time, there is no conclusive evidence of foul play." But Sarah felt the unease ripple through her veins. It didn't add up. A man doesn't vanish with his car for 34 years without someone noticing, without someone asking the right questions. And now that the car was back on land, the silence of the past seemed louder than ever. She turned to Stevens, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Do you believe it was just an accident?" He studied her, rain dripping from his brow. "My job isn't to believe, it's to follow facts. But I'll tell you this, things rarely stay buried this long without a reason." The words hung in the damp air as Sarah glanced back at the car, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. Her instinct screamed that the fragments pulled from the wreckage weren't just pieces of a life lost, they were pieces of a story half told. The crowd began to disperse as deputies cordoned off the area, but Sarah remained rooted in place. The rain eased into mist and the lake behind her rippled as though restless. She knew in her bones that this discovery was only the first chapter of something far deeper, and whatever the truth was, she wasn't turning away. The following day, Sarah returned to the diner, hoping to overhear conversations about the car. Instead, she felt the shift the moment she stepped inside. Conversations hushed, forks paused mid-air, and several pairs of eyes followed her to the counter. The warmth she had sensed earlier had cooled into something watchful, almost hostile. The waitress poured her coffee without the usual smile. "You stirred up a lot," she muttered, barely meeting Sarah's gaze. Sarah offered a polite nod. "I didn't plan for any of this. I just saw something." The woman shrugged, her shoulders tight. "Doesn't matter. Around here, people don't like outsiders poking around. We live with what we live with." Sarah stirred sugar into her coffee, forcing her hands not to tremble. The room's silence pressed down on her, heavy as stone. She felt the invisible line being drawn. Her curiosity wasn't welcome anymore. When she stepped outside, the afternoon sun was deceptively warm, but her skin prickled with unease. A man leaned against the hood of his truck across the street, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched until she turned the corner. Her pulse raced as she walked faster, reminding herself that fear was part of digging into the past. History wasn't polite. It demanded persistence. Still, the hostility in the townsfolk's eyes unsettled her. Later that evening, Linda called her. "They've been talking about you," Linda said, her voice a mix of gratitude and worry. "Some people think you're prying too much. Others are just afraid of what might come out." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "Why wouldn't people want the truth? Don't they want closure?" Linda sighed, a sound weighted with years of disappointment. Closure isn't always comforting. Truth can ruin reputations, can stir up feuds, can remind people of what they'd rather forget. Silence is easier for most. Sarah pressed her forehead against the motel window, watching headlights drift along the dark road outside. "What about you? Do you want me to keep going?" "Yes," Linda answered without hesitation, "because you're the only one who listens. The only one who doesn't dismiss Bobby as some fool who ran away. I can't do this alone anymore." Her conviction steadied Sarah, but it didn't erase the warning signs around her. Later that night, as she returned to her car, she noticed something odd. A slip of paper had been tucked beneath her windshield wiper. She pulled it free, her stomach tightening at the words scrawled in bold letters. "Stop asking questions." Her breath caught. She glanced around the parking lot, but it was empty, silent, except for the hum of a distant streetlight. She crumpled the note in her fist, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. The message was clear: someone wanted her gone. But the very fact that someone felt threatened enough to warn her only deepened her resolve. The next morning she met Stevens near the courthouse, handing him the note. His brows furrowed as he read it. "This town has its ways," he said grimly. "Most people just want to protect themselves, but whoever left this, they're nervous. Nervous people make mistakes." Sarah looked at him, her voice steady despite her unease. "Then maybe we're closer to the truth than they want us to be." He folded the note, slipping it into his jacket. "Just promise me one thing. If you keep digging, you'll be careful. Not everyone here plays fair when it comes to old secrets." Sarah nodded, but in her chest burned the same determination that had carried her this far. Fear wasn't going to stop her. If anything, it was proof she was on the right trail. The following morning, Sarah sat at a wooden table inside the town's small library. The faint smell of paper and dust mixed with the creak of old floorboards as she flipped through yellowed yearbooks. She studied the black and white photos, searching for Bobby Hayes among the grinning faces. There he was, tall, with dark hair, leaning on a locker, a smile that seemed both confident and restless. Across the room, an elderly woman shuffled slowly between shelves, eventually pausing near Sarah's table. "You're looking for Bobby, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling but sharp. Sarah glanced up, startled. "Yes. Did you know him?" The woman lowered herself into a chair. Everyone knew Bobby. He was the boy who dreamed of leaving, talked about California like it was heaven itself. "He was good to my son, always helped him with homework. But he had fire in him, and fire doesn't sit well in a small town." Her words lingered, the air heavy with memory. Sarah scribbled them down. "Do you think he would have left on his own?" The woman shook her head firmly. "No, he loved his sister too much. He wouldn't have gone without her." As Sarah thanked her, she noticed another man nearby, glaring, clearly displeased at the conversation. He muttered something under his breath before leaving abruptly. The tension was unmistakable. Every memory of Bobby carried weight, pulling people into sides they didn't want to revisit. Later that day, Sarah walked along the cracked sidewalks toward the outskirts of town. A neighbor had agreed to speak with her, an older farmer named Earl. He leaned against his porch railing, his weathered face shadowed by a cap. "Bobby Hayes," Earl said after a pause. People talked like he was some saint, but truth is he was reckless. Drove too fast, took risks. Some said he was bound to end up in trouble. Maybe the lake took him before worse could. Sarah studied him carefully. Or maybe he ran into something he couldn't handle. The farmer's eyes flicked toward her, sharp for just a moment before he looked away. "You'd do well not to stir folks up. Town's lived with its peace long enough." Peace. The word felt like a wall thrown up in her path. Every conversation seemed to circle back to it. Peace through silence, peace through forgetting. But to Sarah, it didn't look like peace at all. It looked like resignation. That evening she met Stevens outside the sheriff's office. He handed her a photocopy of a page from the old case file. "This isn't public," he said carefully, "but I think you should see it." The report was thin, barely a handful of notes. "Last seen at Murphy's Diner, argument with Thomas Miller. Witness accounts uncertain, vehicle never located." Sarah frowned. "That's it? No follow-ups? No leads?" Stevens shook his head. The sheriff back then wasn't exactly thorough. He figured Bobby was another restless kid who ran off. Case closed before it ever opened. She traced her finger along the faded type. But Tom Miller was the last to see him. Why didn't they press harder? Stevens exhaled, his shoulders heavy. Tom was respected. His family carried weight. Sometimes in small towns, respect buys silence. The word struck Sarah like a stone. Silence again. Always silence. As she folded the file back into her notebook, she realized the road ahead was narrowing. With each memory she uncovered, the resistance grew stronger. The story wasn't just about Bobby anymore. It was about the web of loyalties and fears that had kept him buried for decades. And somewhere in that web she felt certain lay the truth. Sarah found Tom Miller at his repair shop on the edge of town, a low building with faded paint and the smell of oil heavy in the air. The rhythmic clang of metal against metal echoed as she approached, and she could see him bent over the hood of a pickup. His shoulders were broad, but his movements carried the stiffness of age. When he noticed her, he straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed with recognition. "You're the one asking about Bobby," he said flatly. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I know you were with him the night he disappeared." Tom's jaw tightened. "That was 34 years ago. Nothing good comes from dragging it up again." Sarah held his gaze. "Maybe not for the town, but for his sister, for Linda, it matters." "She's still waiting for the truth." For a moment the rag twisted in his hands. He glanced past her toward the road, as though measuring how much to give. Finally he muttered, "Bobby was hot-headed that night. We argued. He wanted to blow out of town, said he was done with this place. I told him he was acting like a fool. He stormed off, and that's the last I saw of him." Sarah frowned. "You expect me to believe that after 30 years you have nothing else to say? No regrets? No questions of your own?" His face hardened. "You don't know this town. You don't know what was going on back then. Bobby thought he could go up against people he shouldn't. I tried to talk him down, but he wouldn't listen." Her pulse quickened. "What people?" Tom's eyes darkened. He stepped closer, his voice low, almost a growl. "Drop it. I've carried the weight of that night long enough. If you're smart, you'll stop digging before you end up carrying it too." Sarah refused to flinch, though her heart hammered in her chest. "So you're admitting there's more to the story? That he wasn't just a restless kid who drove into a lake?" He shook his head, frustration flickering across his features. "You hear what you want to hear. I'm telling you, some doors stay shut for a reason." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Tom turned back to his work, shoulders rigid, the clang of tools rising again like a shield. Sarah stood there for a moment, her notebook heavy in her hand before she stepped outside into the sharp autumn air. The words repeated in her mind, people he shouldn't go up against. That wasn't the language of an accident. That was the language of fear. As she walked back toward town, she couldn't ignore the sensation of being watched. A curtain twitched in a nearby house. A pickup slowed as it passed her, its driver staring longer than necessary. The pressure of small-town eyes was suffocating, every glance a reminder that she was pushing against walls built decades ago. That evening, she sat with Linda at the farmhouse, recounting what Tom had said. "He knows more," Sarah insisted. "I could see it in the way he avoided my questions." "He's protecting someone." Linda's hands trembled as she poured tea. "Tom was Bobby's closest friend. If he's been silent all these years, it's because he's scared. And if Tom's scared, then maybe Bobby was right. Maybe there were people who wanted him gone." Sarah leaned forward, determination burning in her eyes. "If that's true, then silence isn't just protecting memories. It's protecting the people responsible." The room fell quiet, the weight of unspoken truths pressing heavily between them. Outside, the night settled thick and dark, the kind of silence that carried more menace than peace. Sarah felt it deep in her bones. Whatever Bobby had been caught up in, the town's silence wasn't accidental, and now by chasing his story, she was entangled in it too. The fragment of paper found in Bobby's car had been haunting Sarah's thoughts. She managed to convince Deputy Stevens to let her see a copy, though he made her promise not to mention it outside their conversations. Inside the plastic sleeve, the words were faded and smeared, but a few stood clear. "Debts, threats, won't keep quiet." Sarah stared at the note under the library's dim lamp, the letters etched into her mind. This wasn't a restless young man running away. This was someone cornered, someone tangled in danger. When she met Stevens again outside the courthouse, his expression was guarded. "The sheriff's office isn't planning to release this," he said, lowering his voice. "Officially, we're treating the car as an accident. Too much time has passed, too many gaps." Sarah felt frustration boil in her chest. "But the note isn't enough," Stevens interrupted. "There's no context, no proof of who wrote it or why. The sheriff doesn't want the town tearing itself apart over rumors from 30 years ago." She crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "Or maybe he doesn't want anyone asking why his predecessor buried the case in the first place." Stephen's silence was telling. He looked away, jaw tight, before muttering, "You're not wrong. Sheriff Walters back then, he was more concerned with keeping the town's image clean than finding truth. If Bobby had debts, if he was threatening to expose something, Walters would have preferred to call it a runaway and move on." Sarah's pen raced across her notebook. So Bobby was silenced twice, once in life, once in memory. Stevens exhaled, the weight of his conscience pressing down on him. Careful with that kind of thinking. You can't accuse people without proof. "Then I'll find the proof," Sarah said firmly. Later that afternoon, she sat with Linda at the farmhouse, showing her the copy of the note. Linda's eyes filled with tears as her fingers hovered above the faded words. "I knew it," she whispered. "He was in trouble. He tried to fight it." "That's who Bobby was. He wouldn't stay quiet if something was wrong," Sarah asked carefully. "Did he ever talk about debts, about money?" Linda hesitated, then nodded. "He borrowed some once from people he shouldn't have. Not much, but enough to get their attention. He told me he'd pay it back, but if he wrote this, maybe it was bigger than I thought." The idea tightened around Sarah's chest like a vice. Money, threats, silence. It was a story as old as time, but in this town it had been buried under 3 decades of still water. That evening, Sarah returned to her motel, unable to shake the feeling of momentum. She flipped back through her notes. Bobby's restlessness, Tom Miller's evasions, the town's hostility, and now this fragment. The puzzle pieces were aligning, not into a picture of a man who ran away, but of one trapped by forces stronger than himself. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Stevens, his face grim. "You need to know something," he said quietly. There were whispers back then. Land deals, businesses cutting corners, money changing hands. People said Bobby had found out more than he should have. If that letter was his, it makes sense. Sarah's pulse quickened. And if the sheriff buried it, then the silence wasn't just about protecting Bobby's memory. It was about protecting people still here. Stevens didn't answer directly, but his eyes told her enough. The past wasn't dead. It was alive in the foundations of the town, shaping loyalties and fears even now. As Sarah closed the door behind him, she realized the truth wasn't just waiting to be uncovered. It was fighting to stay hidden. And the closer she got, the more dangerous the silence became. The following morning began with unease. Sarah stepped outside her motel room and froze. Her rental car sat crooked in the lot, its side scratched deep with jagged lines. Glass from a shattered headlight glistened like ice across the pavement. She felt her stomach twist. Her hands trembled as she dialed Stevens. Within 20 minutes he pulled into the lot, his expression hardening the moment he saw the damage. "They're trying to scare you," he said, crouching to inspect the gouges. "This isn't random." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, fighting the chill despite the morning sun. "So they want me gone?" "They want you quiet," Stevens corrected. He straightened, his eyes steady on hers. "But fear is their weapon. You decide whether you let them win." She swallowed hard, drawing strength from his steadiness. "I won't back down." Later that day, she met Linda at the farmhouse. The sight of the vandalism left Linda pale, her hands tightening around a teacup. "I should have known this would happen," she whispered. "They've tried to erase Bobby for 30 years. You digging into this? It threatens the whole lie they built." Sarah reached across the table, her voice steady. "Then we're closer than ever. Fear doesn't come without reason." Tears welled in Linda's eyes. "But what if they hurt you too?" "I couldn't live with that." Sarah shook her head gently. "This isn't just about me. It's about giving Bobby his truth. If we stop now, they win." And his story dies again. The weight of her words filled the room, settling between them. For a long moment, only the creak of the old house echoed. As dusk fell, Sarah walked back toward town, her thoughts heavy. She found herself questioning her motives. Why was she doing this? She could return home, slip back into her life as a teacher, and leave this town's shadows behind. Yet every time she imagined walking away, she pictured Linda's weary eyes and Bobby's faded photograph in the courthouse case. The truth wasn't just about history. It was about people who had been silenced, about the way silence chained generations. She sat on a bench near the square, scribbling in her notebook. Her words came quick, raw. "Curiosity led me here, but justice keeps me. The past doesn't vanish, it waits, and it demands someone willing to listen." Her pen stilled as footsteps approached. Stevens sat beside her, his voice quiet. "You're taking risks, Sarah. More than you realize. Are you sure this is worth it?" She looked at him, her answer immediate. "If no one speaks for Bobby, then who will?" The truth matters, even if it's uncomfortable. For the first time, Stevens's guarded demeanor softened. He exhaled slowly. "Then you're braver than most of us who've lived here our whole lives." The street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows across the square. Sarah felt the tension coil around her like a rope pulled tight. The town was no longer indifferent. It was watching, resisting, warning. Each step forward pressed harder against that rope, but fear could cut both ways. For her, it was a weight to carry. For whoever wanted her silent, it was a sign they were losing control. As the night settled in, Sarah tucked her notebook close to her chest. She whispered to herself, steady as a vow, "I won't stop." Not now. The repair shop was nearly empty when Sarah returned, the afternoon sun slanting through dusty windows. She found Tom Miller hunched over a workbench, his hands motionless on a wrench. He looked older than before, his face worn by years of silence. When he saw her, he didn't scowl this time. Instead, he sighed as though he had been expecting her. "You don't give up, do you?" he muttered. Sarah shook her head. "Not when the truth is hiding." For a long moment he studied her, the silence stretched tight. Then he pulled a stool closer, motioning for her to sit. His voice lowered, gravelly but unsteady. "I've carried this for 34 years. Maybe it's time someone else knows." Sarah leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "That night at Murphy's," Tom began, "Bobby wasn't just restless, he was furious. He'd been digging into things he shouldn't have, land deals, money moving under the table, people in town using their positions for profit. He said he was going to expose it. Said he'd rather burn bridges than keep quiet. Sarah's chest tightened. And you argued? Tom nodded. I told him to stop, to think of his sister, of himself. But he wouldn't hear it. He accused me of being afraid, of siding with people who were poisoning the town. He stormed out. I thought he'd cool off, come back. But he never did. His hands clenched around the wrench. I didn't follow him, didn't stop him, and I've lived with that ever since. Because I knew he was in danger, and I let him walk right into it. Sarah's voice softened. Do you think someone silenced him? Tom's jaw tightened, his eyes clouded with guilt. I can't say it plain, but Bobby had made enemies, men who didn't like to be threatened. When his car vanished, I knew what it meant, but in this town you don't point fingers unless you're ready to pay for it. And I wasn't brave enough. The admission hung in the air, heavy as the smell of oil. Sarah felt anger stir in her chest, anger at the town, at the silence, at the way fear had stolen justice. You've been carrying this for decades, she said. Why tell me now? Tom's shoulders slumped. Because you're the first one who's dared to keep asking. And because maybe, if I say it out loud, Bobby won't just be a ghost in my head anymore. Sarah scribbled his words into her notebook, her hands shaking. If what you're saying is true, the town has lived under a lie all these years. He nodded slowly. And it'll fight to keep that lie standing. You think they vandalized your car just to scare you. That's only the start. People here protect their secrets like they protect their kin. You'd better be ready for the cost. His warning should have filled her with dread, but instead, she felt clarity. The weight of his confession didn't crush her, it steeled her resolve. She stood, tucking her notebook against her chest. Thank you for trusting me, Tom. I can't promise I'll keep quiet. Bobby deserves more than silence. Tom's eyes glistened, his voice breaking for the first time. Then do what I couldn't. Don't let his story die. When Sarah stepped out into the fading light, the air felt heavier, the horizon darker. She had what she needed, a piece of the truth spoken at last. But Tom's warning echoed in her ears. Every answer she uncovered made her a greater target. Still, her path was clear. Silence had ruled long enough. Sarah knew Tom's confession couldn't stay hidden. She carried his words like a live flame, one that burned hotter the longer she kept it to herself. By the next morning, she made her way to the sheriff's office, notebook in hand, heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. Deputy Stevens met her outside, his eyes narrowing at her determined expression. What have you got now? He asked, though the caution in his voice suggested he already knew she had something heavy. I spoke with Tom, Sarah said. He admitted Bobby was threatening to expose corruption. Land deals, money under the table, things that would have embarrassed people in power back then. Tom didn't say names, but he was clear. Bobby wasn't just restless, he was silenced. Stevens stiffened, scanning the street around them before answering. Do you realize what you're saying? If this gets out, you're accusing people who may still hold sway in this town. Maybe that's why no one spoke up for 30 years, Sarah shot back. But silence doesn't erase the truth. They stood in tense silence, the air thick with unspoken consequences. Finally, Stevens muttered, Come inside. We'll talk. In his office, Sarah laid out every detail. Tom's words, the threats in Bobby's note, the resistance she'd faced from townsfolk. Stevens listened, his expression tightening with each piece. When she finished, he leaned back, rubbing his temples. You're forcing me into a corner, he said. If I act on this, I risk going against people my own family has known for generations. But if I ignore it, then I'm no better than Walters was in '85. Sarah met his gaze firmly. You became a deputy to serve justice, not comfort. Bobby Hayes deserves the truth. Linda deserves the truth. And deep down, this town deserves it too. Stevens let out a long breath. You make it sound simple. It's not, she admitted, but it's right. Word spread faster than either of them expected. By the following day, whispers swirled through the diner, the church steps, the grocery store. Some townsfolk looked at Sarah with gratitude, others with disdain. A farmer muttered, She's tearing this place apart, while another whispered, Finally, someone's saying what we all knew. That evening, Linda called, her voice trembling. "People are talking. They're saying Bobby stood up against the wrong men. They're saying he paid for it. Do you know what it feels like, Sarah, to finally hear others admit he mattered?" Sarah swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "It's only the beginning, Linda. The truth is stronger than silence, even if it takes years to break through." But not everyone shared that relief. Outside the motel, Sarah caught sight of a man glaring at her from a truck window, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't speak, didn't move, just let the threat of his presence linger before driving off. That night Stevens knocked on her door. His face was grave, but there was resolve in his eyes. "You've lit a fire," he said. "Half the town wants it out, the other half wants it smothered. But either way, it's burning now." "Will you stand with me?" Sarah asked. He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, someone has to." The decision changed everything. No longer was Sarah an outsider chasing curiosity. She had allies, but she also had enemies. The story was no longer just Bobby's. It had become a mirror, reflecting the soul of the town itself. And Sarah knew mirrors could cut as sharply as glass. The tension that had gripped the town for weeks reached its peak when Linda announced a memorial service for Bobby. Word spread quickly, carried by whispers and side glances. Some muttered that it was long overdue, others said it would only stir the past again. But on a crisp autumn afternoon, people gathered in the churchyard, drawn by something stronger than their fears. Sarah stood beside Linda near the steps, watching faces file in, some lined with guilt, others with curiosity. The air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and wood smoke. For Linda, every handshake, every glance seemed to carry 34 years of weight. When the service began, the pastor's words were simple. Robert Hayes was part of this town. His story was cut short, but today we honor his life, his laughter, his dreams. No silence can erase his place among us. Sarah felt her throat tighten as Linda stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "My brother wasn't perfect. He was stubborn, reckless, and restless. But he loved fiercely. He wanted better for himself, for me, for this town. For 34 years, people told me to stop asking, to accept silence. But silence isn't peace, and today, finally, we break it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, tears glistening. Others shifted uncomfortably. Sarah could see the divide etched clearly, but she also saw something else, cracks forming in the wall of silence that had held the town captive. After the service, townsfolk approached Linda, some offering apologies, others only standing close in quiet acknowledgement. One elderly man removed his cap, his voice breaking. "I should have spoken up back then. I was afraid. But Bobby deserved better." Linda gripped his hand tightly. "It's not too late to remember him the right way." Sarah stood nearby, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. She hadn't expected to become so entangled, but in Linda's words she felt the truth of her own journey. This wasn't just about history. It was about the courage to demand truth when silence was easier. Later, as the crowd thinned, Stevens approached Sarah. "You did it," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "Linda did it. She carried Bobby all these years. I just helped shine a light." He studied her for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "Maybe that's all justice is, someone willing to shine a light, even when others turn away." The two stood in silence, watching the last of the townsfolk drift down the road. For the first time since her discovery on the lake, Sarah felt the air lift around her, as if the weight of unspoken truth had finally begun to loosen its grip. That evening, Linda invited Sarah back to the farmhouse. They sat on the porch, watching the horizon glow with the last light of day. "I don't know how to thank you," Linda said softly. "You gave me something I thought I'd never have. Answers. Not all, but enough." Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes enough is all we get. Sometimes it's all we need." Linda's eyes shone with tears, but they were lighter now, no longer burdened by endless wondering. "I can finally grieve him, really grieve him. And that means I can finally live again, too." The words lingered in the cool evening air, a promise of healing after decades of silence. Sarah felt her chest tighten with a mixture of sorrow and relief. She had come here for a quiet vacation, and instead, she had been transformed. The story of Bobby Hayes had changed her, reminding her that history isn't just dates and facts. It's voices, sometimes silenced, sometimes forgotten, that still deserve to be heard. Sarah packed her suitcase slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care, as though the weight of the past week lingered on every item. The motel room was quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, still but forever changed. Outside, the leaves had begun to fall in earnest, swirling along the pavement in shades of amber and rust. She paused at the window, staring out at the road that wound back toward the lake. The same lake where it had all begun, where the past had risen from the water and demanded to be heard. She hadn't expected any of this when she signed up for a simple kayak tour. Yet standing there now, she couldn't imagine leaving unchanged. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. When she opened it, Linda stood there, holding a small framed photo of Bobby. His smile in the picture was bright, almost mischievous, untouched by the weight of what would come. "I wanted you to have this," Linda said, her voice soft. "You gave me back my brother's story." "This picture is all I have left, but it feels lighter now, like the grief isn't chained anymore." Sarah accepted it carefully, her throat tight. "Thank you, Linda. I don't know if I deserve this." "You do," Linda insisted. "You didn't have to care. But you did." That means everything. They embraced, and for the first time Sarah felt not like an outsider, but like someone woven into the fabric of Bobby's memory. Later, Stevens drove her to the bus station. The ride was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space. Finally he said, "You know you've done more for this town than most of us ever dared." Sarah gave a faint smile. "I didn't do it alone. You chose to stand with me." He chuckled dryly. Maybe you reminded me why I put on this badge in the first place." His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Either way, you've changed things here." The bus pulled into the station, its brakes hissing. Sarah gathered her bag, heart heavy yet steady. She stepped down, the cool air wrapping around her, and turned back one last time. Stevens tipped his hat in quiet farewell. As the bus rolled out of town, she pressed her forehead against the glass, watching the streets shrink into the distance. She thought of Bobby Hayes, the young man who had refused to stay silent, whose voice had been stolen but not erased. She thought of Linda, finally free to grieve. She thought of the townsfolk, divided but now forced to reckon with their past. Most of all, she thought of herself. She had come seeking rest, but instead found purpose. The story had demanded more of her than she ever expected, and in answering, she had grown stronger, braver, more certain of why truth mattered. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photo frame tucked safely in her bag. A reminder, a promise. And as the bus carried her away, Sarah whispered to herself, "Truth always finds a way back." Before we close, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life stories that uncover hidden truths. And if you want to continue this journey, click on the video suggested here on screen. You won't want to miss the next mystery waiting to be uncovered. The story of Bobby Hayes had come to its end, but the echo of it remained, a testament that silence can bury many things but not forever. Eventually the past rises, demanding to be heard.